pushing the record button. So I've done an audio check-in with a handful of our participants and got back to my screen after I followed up an email with Pam. And I expect her to join us shortly, but we are ready to go.
Okay, how many folks do we have?
Great. So I showed 26. I'm expecting around 30 and some. So we should have a good turnout.
Great, excellent,
Checking for
excellent.
prompts, questions, hands raised before we start. Great. Okay, so we have, let me get my file together here. The agenda was up a few minutes ago as people were signing on, and pretty much we begin with introductions of the presenters. So I'll start. This is Michelle Collet. I'm facilitating the webinar tonight, and I'm co-teaching the course EDU 805 with Michael Bowden, who is the lead instructor. Michael, go ahead and introduce yourself again to our colleagues.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be back for webinar number 2, and glad to see or at least hear and view so many of you participating tonight. Either that means you're excited about this project or confused or both, but hopefully we'll have you more excited and less confused at the end of the session. I've been involved in this grand enterprise of the online doctoral program in leadership since its genesis, and so happy to still be connected with it and contributing to its success. So look forward to working with you throughout the rest of this course and helping you ferret out the mysteries of the change proposal in this evening's session.
Great. So what we're going to do first here is I've asked Michael to briefly, probably 5 to 7 minutes, go through the change proposal via the consultancy prompts. I'll have just the headers or the main points up on the screen. The more extensive text, there's some in the modules themselves and on the original draft of this material, which is where I got this. So Michael, why don't you get us started and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you. Uh, so I'll speak as Michelle suggests for 5 or 8 minutes at the very most, and then we'll take questions afterwards. But I'd like to just give you my sense of what I think this project is all about, why I think it's a valuable exercise for you to participate in and will contribute to your repertoire of leadership skills. It's what I call putting it all together. That is the final product of this course. And by saying putting it all together, what I mean is the first 4 weeks, there was a lot of inputs, a lot of reading, a lot of short papers and essays and exercises. And all of those were designed to give you new knowledge, information, ideas, skills, tools to work with, hopefully to put in your toolkit as a leader, but also using a constructivist approach. All of those activities in the first 4 weeks were really intended to be the precursor and sort of building blocks for the change proposal. So I hope these past 4 weeks have been meaningful in terms of what you were asked to do, because the quality of your work demonstrated that you really got into it and made a lot of effort to do quality work. And presumably, hopefully, all of what you've done is going to put you in good shape, be a solid foundation for going forward. And in fact, everything that you've done theoretically can be an integral component of the change proposal. It may go through some textual changes and editing or embellishing, but view every assignment you've done so far and all the reading you've done as tools that, as resources that will go into the change proposal. And what I'd like to do is to give you a little bit of the rationale as to why we think this particular activity is so critical for leaders to acquire and make part of their repertoire. Um, when a lot of leaders are good at articulating a vision that can be quite compelling and motivating to followers and elicit a fair amount of enthusiasm and commitment. But the real rub is the implementation. Leaders, a lot of organizations are long on vision and short on implementation. And so what the change proposal wants you to do is to articulate a vision, explain where it is you want to go and where you want to take other people, your colleagues and organization or people you're working with or for. What's the rationale for getting there? What are the benefits of it? Why is some change from the status quo warranted? And what is the strategy that you would use to get there? So the first step in that is to diagnose what is going on at the moment, and then to develop a viable direction for getting there, and to get people to become enthusiastic. Maybe not initially, there might be a lot of reluctant participants, but eventually the idea is to create a vision and then a strategy for implementing that vision that elicits enough enthusiasm and commitment that you aren't feeling like you're alone in the wilderness. And the change proposal gives you a chance to formulate all those ideas that you think are going to be effective and useful in crafting that proposal. So you begin by creating, establishing, explaining, detailing, describing the context. What is the organization? What's your role in it? What's going on? What works? What doesn't work? And then express why you feel some alternative approach or strategy or activity or goal is preferable to the status quo. And the next thing is to then begin to develop a direction for getting there and expressing that, designing that in a way that is going to be convincing enough to followers that instead of just dutifully following you, they become enthusiastic collaborators and participants in that process. So what we suggest is that you use the critical problem inventory as a guide, as prompts, and you've gotten familiar with that tool, and hopefully you found it useful. But not use the CPI prompts as necessarily headings or sections of the change proposal. Those are kind of implied contents, but instead you want to uh, organize and structure the change proposal in the parts that we've laid out in the document that we're showing you on the screen. So the first one is, a major section with the context that introduces the whole paper and the purpose of the paper, and then the setting, and then where you want to go. And the whole part two focuses on the diagnosis and the direction, meaning a strategy, as I just discussed. Part three is where you get into a detailed strategy of what you're going to do to get from A to B, and what are the transformative features of this change process. It's not simply, and I want to emphasize this, the idea of this change proposal is not simply to come up with a proposal that's transitional, that is, transits from where you are now to where you want to be within 3 or 6 months. And then that's sort of the end of the process. This should be an ongoing process, i.e. a transformative planning process where you're creating the conditions for change in the organization, but also creating the conditions for not a single change, but to create a climate or a culture for continuous change. And that requires that the last part of the proposal, you're really getting into a a presentation to finish it off as to what what you see as the benefits of this, why you think you're getting the organization in a better place, and what would be the next step. In other words, not just be satisfied with articulating, crafting, designing a strategy for implementing the change, but how would you institutionalize the culture of continuous innovation and change? So that's how you begin to wrap it up. You pull the final aspects of the paper together saying, here's what I propose to do, here's how we're going to go about doing it, here's why we're going to do it, here are the benefits of it, and here is what we envision for maybe the subsequent stage of innovation and change, which would come after you implemented and institutionalized the immediate change proposal. So I'd like to finish this brief orientation by reminding you of what I use as my favorite working definition of leadership, and that's creating the conditions for change. It's not you doing the change yourself. It's creating an environment, an attitude, a set of behaviors and expectations where you're creating conditions for other people to collaborate and embrace the change process and contribute to it in a way that's meaningful to them. That's really what a transformative leader does. And final thought, as you're working on this over the next 4 weeks, uh, think of this great quote, which I almost used in one of the original quotes that we asked you to react to at the very beginning of the course. This one is by the poet T.S. Eliot, and one of my favorite lines from T.S. Eliot, which is so, I think, relevant to managing change, is this quote: "Between the idea and the reality falls the shadow."
Mm.
And your change proposal articulates the idea, but that's the easy part. The hard part is crafting strategy for implementation. That's the reality. And so your job is to eliminate as many shadows as you can in the change proposal.
All right. Thank you for that lovely, articulate, and succinct setup of a more complex project. I'm going to have our colleagues introduce themselves. And while I do that, the rest of the participants, I'm going to recommend to you that you either send your questions via the question box and or use the hand raise function. I'm going to ask Nina Cunningham to go first because she posted some questions in the discussion board earlier. I picked them up, but I'm going to ask her to go ahead and use her voice and share those. Some of them have been addressed, I think, by Michael, but we'll let her do that. And then we'll field some more questions. After that, I've asked Pam Flood, who is doing the summative work 1 year out with the change proposal, to give us some insight she's gaining from supporting the people ahead of you in them completing the task. So, Doug, I'm going to find your gadget here and open it up and let you introduce yourself. Doug, hi, good evening.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me?
You're loud and clear.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that orientation, Michael. As usual, it's very succinct and yet very prescient for the issues that we need to deal with. And I'm looking forward to sharing the ideas that my colleagues have as they move forth on their leadership journey.
Great. Thanks for joining us and thanks for saying hello. So, Pam, I'm going to get down to your mic here and open it up and let you introduce yourself to the group tonight. You're on, Pam.
Hi, everyone. Pam Flood here. I'm very happy to be joining you all and listening to this webinar. And Michael, great to hear your voice and listen to your thinking as always. So thank you.
Great. Okay, Nina, can you hear me?
Hi, yep, can you hear me?
Great. Thank you for coming in with your voice. You'll see earlier in the night I had your questions pasted up into the agenda, but I have
Yep.
you on hand. So why don't you go ahead and raise those questions again? As I said, I think Michael addressed some of your questions, but go ahead and state them again.
Okay. So my first question was, can we use our CPI in our previous site descriptions from 801 if they're still relevant?
Yes, thanks, Nina. And that's a good question. And I think I did partially answer. I'll give a
Yeah.
brief additional supplementary response. And first, let me say I don't have a monopoly on how everything should be done here. So if my faculty colleagues want to uh, add anything to what I say, please do, number one. And number two, I'm not necessarily always cogent and coherent. So if I respond to a question and you think I'm completely off the mark or I've made it even fuzzier, uh, jump in and say, I need something more from you. So yes, indeed, the idea of using all the stuff that you've previously developed is very much relevant and appropriate to integrate into it. And as I said, these are sort of a constructivist approach. So anything that you've used that you think is germane, that will contribute to the richness of your final proposal, please do. But keep in mind that might require some appropriate editing, because some of the prompts you got for a previous assignment, may require a little bit of tinkering with how you originally responded to a question or how you formulated an essay in a previous assignment. But it's absolutely appropriate for you to integrate anything. And as I said, if you use the critical problem inventory, it's probably not appropriate to structure your final paper using the CPI as your headers or your outline, but nonetheless you can cleverly work in anything that you any data that you generated from the CPI can surely find its way into the final proposal.
I'm just looking at the part one outline, Michael. I can see that the second bullet there explain why intervention is warranted. Most people did address that to some degree in their CPIs.
Yes, absolutely.
Because they chose problems to present in that write-up that they felt strongly intervention was warranted. So, Nina, is that helpful in terms of looking at some alignment there?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure.
Sure. So. Yeah. Double dip away. Any other questions? Nina, you had a couple of other questions.
I guess I read through some of the examples that were given, and the first section seems relatively short. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing the mark on that.
When you say the first section, are you talking specifically about an introduction or part one?
Just part one.
Well, first of all, let me say that when we share with you exemplars of other papers, we're not doing that so that we expect you to dutifully, mimic what you've seen. I think a lot of people can learn by seeing a visual of the final result of a similar assignment, say from a previous cohort of students. But the idea, it's for you to get ideas and to say, so that's how they put that together. It's not for you to feel the pressure that, oh, well, this section was 350 words, so I got to make sure mine is, no more than 350 words. So that's a roundabout way of saying, if it struck you that a introductory section of the paper was relatively short, and you feel you can adequately convey the salient elements of that section in even fewer words, fine. But if you need more words to give a thorough, enhancement or explanation of the setting, of the context, or whatever, then you should do that, because the the introduction really sets the tone. It provides the context, and if the reader or whoever your audience is doesn't kind of quite comprehend exactly what the environment is that you're tinkering with, so to speak, then it makes it difficult to perhaps follow the flow of everything that comes afterwards. So ultimately, you as a author and the chief designer of this proposal, you'll have to determine what's the right number of words to convey the most critical information.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else,
Did you
Nina,
have
to
a
add
third
to that?
question?
Um, well, I guess it kind of you kind of just answered it. That I was thinking about part one and how it just kind of naturally flows into the second part and whatnot. So I thought if I'm on a roll, I'm just gonna keep going.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
know,
Hey, if you want to pull an all-nighter and write part two,
well, maybe not, but
uh, no, but no, I encourage anybody who's working on this. You develop a pace and you build up some momentum. And we may not be explicitly saying we're calling for part two, and you may not necessarily be ready to submit it, but
yeah, okay,
if you're putting this together on your own pace, you use your own good judgment in terms of the energy and the focus that you've got, and if you're on a roll, then keep rolling.
okay, thank you.
I'd like to say a little bit about the scope of the change initiative, and I think we addressed this in 801 to some degree. Um, what's a challenge, I think, for the part one is framing the context broadly enough that it makes sense that there's an intervention that's warranted, but narrowly enough that you can actually generate goals and indicators for success. So, for example, if you look at the Common Core initiative, or you look at proficiency-based report cards, a couple of cases that we've written and that we're experiencing here in Maine, and I know it's happening nationally. If you talk about teachers adopting wholeheartedly proficiency-based report cards as the initiative, that's very large, and you would be quite challenged. I think any of us would be quite challenged to have um, narrow and measurable goals and indicators for success. So if the goal is that all teachers in a district effectively use proficiency based report cards, that's going to take 5 years. And that's going to be 70% of the people, 50% of the time. I mean, you're not going to get there completely in any of these kinds of very broad and complex initiatives. So we recommend that you choose a smaller and more doable initiative that you can actually map out for the next 12 months and show some movement. When Pam steps in here in a few minutes to say what she's seeing in the 12-month out projects, she will probably address this business about goals and indicators. We tend to, particularly I think in education, grab onto some pretty large and generalized problems and then generalized solutions. And so we can't really articulate in deliverable ways what can happen differently. And then we end up kind of spinning. So in terms of the shortness or the succinctness of the part one, Nina, I think it's really essential that you do what Michael said and you said, move through it and move on if you're ready to go on. Don't feel like you have to stay there. On the other hand, the more specific you can be in that setup, I think the easier the whole project will be to map.
Yeah, good advice, Michelle. Better to, if you do the critical problem inventory and you come up with three massive dilemmas or problems to resolve, uh, it would be better to tackle one and do a really nice job coming up with a strategy for dealing with that one rather than coming up with three kind of half-hearted strategies for a three-part problem that you or anybody else might be beyond your ability to take on anyway. So better to focus in and really do a very well developed proposal that deals with a more limited challenge than taking on You know, most organizations have lots of pathologies, whether they're evident or not, and probably need a lot of work and attention to make them better. But that may be just too ambitious, and you might get in over your head.
Michael, I would be helpful, I think, if you would address audience. So if I'm drafting my change proposal and I'm responding to these prompts, my audience to some degree is the instructors, but to a more applied degree or relevant degree in my day job is my team and my stakeholders. So, can you give us some advice as we're drafting the responses to this material in terms of holding maybe multiple audiences at the same time and or drafting a version that we might then modify depending on the audience? How do you think about
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
transition
yeah,
between the initial responses and then to our different stakeholder audiences?
yeah. Good point. Don't you know? Even though we're the ones that are going to be the ones assessing, critiquing, and grading the quality of your presentation, uh, see myself, Michelle, and Doug as sort of the invisible audience. Uh, that that's not really who you're actually writing to. You ought to be thinking about your role as the author and whether you're a participant, an observer, a consultant, a member of a task force or committee or project team that's been assigned by the executive director of the agency or by the dean of the college, and or you're writing a report for the faculty senate if you're in academia. So yeah, write this thing in a tone that speaks most clearly to an intended audience that you want to convey the message to. Don't don't write as if you're satisfying uh, three college or university professors in the EDD program. Write it with a more practice or real life audience in mind, and you may in fact have a very real audience who you will ultimately be submitting this to try to convince them to buy into it, and that's so much the better. If it's somewhat contrived and you're not sure who ultimately might be getting the benefit of your good work here, uh, and sort of create some sort of a potential audience. But whether it's a real or artificial audience that gets the report, write it for them, not one of us.
Great. Okay, I'm not seeing any print questions come in, so I'm going to go ahead and open Pam's mic and have her tell us a little bit about what she's seeing in the summative pieces of work. Pam, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Hi everyone, it's great to connect with you again. And I've been working with a group that is currently in 811, and this is a focus on the change proposal assessment and next steps. And I think as you're moving out to implementation, if you keep in mind the continuous improvement cycle, which is you plan, which is you're doing now, you're planning and studying. So you sort of plan, do, study, act. It's just this cyclical process that you engage in. And I had the chance to work closely with Michael and Michelle in designing 811 to make sure that it mapped on well to what you're doing now. And what I'm finding is that the first part, the students are asked to create an executive report, which is really going in and telling the story of what happened. What was the need that was identified, and moving through that whole process, what was the implementation, how was it determined, who was a guiding coalition, how were things communicated, and so forth. And many of the individuals have found this report really helpful for them. It gave them a chance, one, to look at what was working well. Some of them found out what wasn't working so well, where they might have gotten off track a bit or whatever. So it's created some really great conversations for them to take back to their stakeholders. And they are asked to do a stakeholder presentation of the process to date and garner feedback, and then pull together. It may be the same guiding coalition, it may be a different guiding coalition. As you know, environments change rather rapidly in this day and age, and so people who had administrators that are no longer there, where they had initial buy-in, that sort of thing, created some different approaches that might need to be used, or they may need to sort of reinvent some of the initiative to bring people up to speed and craft buy-in so that it's creating engagement with individuals. But overall, the students that have had success with their implementation, and that doesn't mean that it was necessarily the specifically right intervention, but they were able to think about as you are implementing is really identifying what are your measurable goals and objectives and how do those align with the vision and how are you communicating those, and then the types of data that will be important for you to look at to determine the efficacy of the implementation and the efficacy of the intervention. Michael was really clear when we were looking at putting the assessment piece together, is that it may be the right idea but not the right time, or it might be the right time and not necessarily the right intervention. And so really being open to looking at what's going on and collecting that data so that you're making the best changes for the organization and the people who live in that organization and are served by the organization. Michael or Michelle, do you want to add anything?
I have a few thoughts. Michael, do you want to go first?
Just a quick comment from what Pam just said. Yeah, I think it's important. We were talking a moment ago about the audience, and of course, part of your audience are the stakeholders. They may not be active participants. They may be the recipients of the change proposal, but they might experience some consequences. And so it's possible that whether you have active contributors to the change proposal, you have people who become beneficiaries of the change proposal, they're all stakeholders, and they're all going to be impacted in some way. And part of your change proposal needs to be thinking about the impact, consequences, outcomes, and whether it's going to be received positively or negatively. And it's not inappropriate in a change proposal to have sort of plan A and plan B. You know, plan A may be the ideal plan, the preferred plan, and this is what the strategy is intending to achieve. But it's okay to have sort of a plan B, so that is a contingency plan, because there are lots of things, you know, life happens, and however noble our goals, so you may be working very hard with a team on a change proposal, and something goes awry, something intervenes, some sort of catastrophic organizational event, you know, a new leader that's better or worse than the old one, priorities change, etc. So keep in mind that a good leader doesn't craft the ideal proposal and try to convince everybody this is exactly the way it's got to end up. Be willing and prepared to offer up some alternative outcomes, backup plans, things that are less than perfect, but that can be part two of the change process.
Pam, talk a little bit about the data collection process. I've got the part 3 up on the screen here. The business about evaluation plans and some of the examples you've seen that are effective and maybe less effective.
Well, I think, again, it's having very specific, what are your indicators for success and how are you going to measure those? And that's where people can go back and reflect on that. I do not ask that students submit specific data in the report they turn in to me. That the report that they share with stakeholders, their stakeholder group, and they get to choose who that will be, will include that data. For the report they turn in to the course, they talk about the data that they looked at or they reviewed and what they, sort of the general themes of findings of that. But you do want to think about, if you're looking at increasing student engagement, what would be indicators of that? It might be less absenteeism. So you would determine what are some of the interventions or steps of the intervention that you're putting into place, and what are the multiple ways that you are measuring the success or the efficacy of that intervention. If you're trying, and you're trying to create a healthier climate in your organization where people engage in problem solving, you would think about ways that you would step that out. That would be indicators, and then data that would inform if that's moving in the right direction. And many of you are, because I got to read a lot of your one proposals when you were doing your change piece there, and you did the logic model, and you were identifying some specific data that you would collect or indicators for success. So keep that in mind as you're generating those, because you will want to start collecting that information. You'll do a what do you call it, Michelle, like a midterm assessment of this before they come into 801. You'll have a chance to start looking at some data before you get into 801. And so as you're saying this,
Pam,
really thinking about
Pam.
what is it?
Hello, Pam.
Yes.
Your audio is a
Yeah.
little funky. I was waiting for it to
Oh.
clear up, but it's not. So I'm gonna just push pause on you for a second. I don't know if you want to try to go out and come
Okay.
back in, but yeah, thanks for the heads up. A couple of you checked in as well. What I'd like to do is get Michael's mic back open and give a couple of more examples. Pam was on a roll of what she was saying, but I'm not sure everybody could hear it. So some examples of the kind of data that you might collect is if you're trying to establish a guiding coalition and you identify stakeholders that haven't been at the table. And over the first 6 months of your change proposal, 3 of the 5 stakeholders that were missing are now attending meetings. And one of those 3 has actually had an influence on the agenda. That is change data. So the event of the people showing up and participating is important information that you want to capture and build on as you move through your 6 months, the first half of the year of the change proposal, as opposed to the initiative was fully implemented and everybody's participating in enacting whatever that vision was. So I'm trying to make sure I'm characterizing the change initiative includes very much the processes, the change of who's at the table, and as Michael was saying, the creating the conditions that the stakeholders will show up. And I'll give you a classic case from my urban school work in Oakland, where mainstream teachers of all races would complain that parents weren't active when all the business of the meeting was conducted in Spanish. And so the non-Spanish speakers wouldn't come to the meetings. And here in Maine, it seems kind of odd, I suppose, but in a case where the school was in a community which was primarily Spanish speaking and non-Spanish speakers, and culturally and racially was primarily African American in this case, didn't come to meetings because they couldn't understand what was being said. So the mainstream, primarily white teachers who were English, Spanish speaking, hadn't really thought about how Spanish lack of translation would exclude a stakeholder because they were so happy to finally have translation going on and having things going on in Spanish. So it was kind of a backwards problem that nobody predicted, and it created a lot of problems with excluding stakeholders. And you would think it would be obvious, but until those parents came directly to speak about that problem, it was not recognized as serious as it was. So I don't know if that's a helpful example.
Yeah, I think it is. And what Michelle is talking about, and when she started on this particular thread, reminds me that I don't think we've emphasized one aspect of this uh, a proposal enough. And so I'd like to take just a minute to make sure everybody understands and appreciates this distinction. The title of the activity or the paper or the project is a change proposal. It's not a report of a change that's already taken place. Therefore, you need to take some pains in your presentation to clarify what change elements, real, meaningful, notable change elements have already occurred. Because after all, if you are working with the same original site that you developed in 801, not, 3 years haven't gone by, but several months have, 6 to 8 months, I guess, by now. So there may well be some notable changes that have occurred, and you should chronicle those. And then there's other changes that are part of your strategy, or serendipitous changes that occurred that or are unfolding, but they are yet to be determined in terms of the precise outcome. So this change proposal should have sort of different time zones, if you will, and you report things that have happened to date and their impact on the stakeholders. You report things that are sort of in progress, where you detect meaningful progression towards some desired outcomes. And then the next part is those ultimate outcomes that you envision happening at the end of the change process, but most likely beyond the end of this particular course. So take the time to make a distinction between changes already occurred, changes in progress, and changes uh, to be desired and not yet arrived at.
Great, thank you. Michael, Pam, you want to come in and see how your audio is before we talk a little bit about the evaluation and the submitting of the 3 versions?
Sure. Is this any better?
Way better. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I went out and came back in. I think the other thing too, when you move out of this or as you're implementing, is to keep in mind for the unintended positive and negative outcomes and data that inform those. And I will just kind of stop with that piece.
Mhm.
You have the
Oh,
You still there, Pam?
yeah, I'm here.
yeah.
Yeah,
I just didn't want to
I'm
take.
picking up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to pick up real quickly. Uh, you folks should not be reluctant, embarrassed, hesitant to acknowledge unforeseen and even undesirable consequences of what you're doing. I mean, that's part of the courage of being a leader. If you're trying to make some good things happen and you're absolutely convinced this is going to get the organization in a better place, it ain't always going to come out just the way you want. So be prepared and willing to uh, acknowledge that, well, this didn't quite happen the way that we envisioned or wanted it to, and here's why. That in itself is a valuable exercise and a valuable learning activity for leaders to improve their practice. Acknowledge what isn't working and try to explain, diagnose what you might have done to make it work out better, or what you might do next time. And that's an acceptable thing to include in your paper.
In terms of the folks coming into the 811, I have done some one-to-ones with them as well as Pam. And in the few cases where people started to say, really, not a lot has changed. Either I wasn't able to leverage the change, or the leadership team changed, or the situation changed, or whatever. All these external things outside my control. And so we're advising those folks to focus on what decisions they did make, what events did take place, how they responded to those, and how they brought their leadership strategies and goals to the events as they unfolded. Again, as Michael's saying, it's not going to go as you predict. It's kind of like as a teacher, you have a really good lesson plan so that you can move away from it when you need to, not if you need to, because the children don't come in the door the same every day, and a group of colleagues certainly does not. And there's a lot of pressures on those folks as well. So documenting every little piece that you have control over and those other larger pieces that you don't, it's all good. It all matters, and it will help you in your decision making, and certainly in bringing your stakeholders along. Pam, anything else on that front here before we talk about the submission process?
No, I think that's good.
Great. Okay. So just briefly, I'm buzzing through to remind you that back to the initial questions we started with tonight, if you look at the rubric and stick to the right-hand column, you'll be asked to look at some peer work in your study groups, and you'll be asked, of course, to submit your own project 3 times. So the first thing I would like to say is that we set up the project so that, let me land on a page here. Should never hand people stuff to read while you're talking. I'm going to go to part 3. You'll be asked to submit your first part 1 here at the end of this module. If it's partially done, turn it in anyway. If it's done and part of 2, as Nina described earlier tonight, turn that all in too. The purpose of the first 2 submissions is to get explicit feedback from both a member or 2 of your study group, and you do that via sharing your files in that study group forum, and from your facilitator, one of the 3 of us. So if it's partially done, that's not an issue. Turn in what you have, ask for feedback, get feedback, and also take your materials to your work team at your workplace. And again, mix and match. Who's the audience? The audience is both my colleague group at work, my study group members, and the instructors. So you'll get good feedback from all 3. Until the final submission, which includes all 3 parts, there's no grade conferred, there's feedback given. So turn in whatever you have. You can put drafting materials in there. You can ask questions about, is this a strong reference to support this piece of work? It's intended to be an interactive developmental process through that first 2 submissions. And I'm going to mute somebody because there's something going on here.
Yeah.
All right.
I want to.
Anything else on that, Michael? I don't know who's
I want to add a
making the
word about
record.
the submission process and the draft review. It's very important that everybody recognize that this is a valuable opportunity that you have. You know, some programs like this, whether a master's or doctoral program, and there's major papers due, is the culminating activity of a course that constitutes a lot of the final grade. You know, you write your 3,000 or whatever words, and then you submit it, and you hold your breath and take your chances in terms of what kind of feedback and assessment and grade you get. In this case, you get a chance to get some feedback early and often. Well, not often, but you get feedback while the thing is in process. And we're viewing these as drafts, not as perfect works. So if you get feedback from one of us that says, well, this is overall really in the right direction, here's some strong elements to it, here's what needs a little bit of work, you know, I encourage you not to be disheartened by that, or to say, oh, gee, I'm just not doing this thing right. You know, don't fall apart if we don't give you anything but, you know, praise, because the point of this is really for you to benefit from whatever wisdom, insight, experience we have in having done this kind of writing ourselves, and then mentoring a lot of other students who have done it. So view it as an opportunity, not something that could potentially be you know, disheartening to you because we didn't say it was perfect as is. I've done a lot of writing and a lot of publishing, and I can tell you that it's very seldom that you submit a manuscript, say, to a peer-reviewed journal where they accept it as is the first time you submit it. And for those of you who hope to go on and do some scholarly work, which presumably all of you will do, even beyond the doctorate. Uh, Use this as a valuable opportunity to get useful feedback. All it's going to do is make that final paper that much better.
Yep, well said.
Any more
So
questions?
yeah, somebody raised a good question, which is those how the study groups will function for this. You'll see some indications in the modules, but generally, what we recommend is that you have groups of 7 in your study groups. Generally, you want to pick 1 or 2 other people to invite to read your work through the 3 cycles, as opposed to a lot of people giving a little bit of feedback. Better a couple of people give detailed feedback. Plus, you become familiar with the project, and you've said the last cycle, have you looked at stakeholders that represent blah blah blah, and then you read it a second time and they still haven't talked about stakeholders. Then you can say, didn't I ask about stakeholders, as opposed to reading a little bit of this and that and giving sort of more shotgun or small bits of feedback. So you get to use your study group members in the way that's most effective for you. I do have some peer review materials that I think are in the modules, but I can double check to see that they're there. They're sort of supplementary. A lot of you do peer review work at your workplaces for reports and for other colleagues. Generally, what's required in the first 2 cycles of this presentation is not so much wordsmithing, but making sure people are addressing the far right-hand column of the rubric, the big ideas, the communicating a sound strategy, have a way to map the evaluation. So you're really looking primarily for substantive work on the part of your peer, and that's what we'll look for. When the 3rd submission comes in, we'll be paying more attention to the fine-tuning, make sure it's readable. If you were to take this down to your school board or take it to a stakeholder in a nonprofit or wherever you work, would it pass muster? We will take a more careful look at that for the 3rd round. But really, the first 2 rounds are substance primarily. Okay.
So my understanding is there's about 2/3 of the class in this webinar, and whenever I do a Q&A, I always say this. So I'm saying it, it's sort of a generic statement, but it's almost always a valid one. Some of you have, I'm sure, a question that you really want to ask before this seminar ends in 10 minutes, but you probably are thinking, geez, it's probably sort of going to sound like a dumb question. But you know what? There's probably a dozen other people who have the very same question. So you'll be doing yourself and everybody else a favor if you pose the question now, and everybody will finish the seminar thinking, oh, I'm so glad that she asked that question.
All right, we'll give them about a minute of wait time. Madeline Hunter would be proud, and then we'll get ready to close the session.
I mean, if you don't have a burning question before, 9 o'clock when we all, turn into pumpkins, you are always allowed to pose it in appropriate venue in the course. But right now, if you pose the question, the virtue of it is that everybody gets the benefit of the response. So
yeah,
please ask any question you want.
All right, I'm seeing none. I'm going to suggest that we move to closure. Let me pull Doug back in here to see if he'd like to add anything. Doug, let me get your microphone open. Been trying to manage the feedback. I think mostly we've done pretty well, except for Pam, and she's now signed off. All right, Doug, your mic's open. Anything you want to add to close the session?
No, thank you, Michelle and Michael. I appreciate this orientation, and I think it's a very positive way of moving us forward. Thank you both.
Great. Okay, so we're closing the session formally. I've asked one individual to stay on the line. Michael, I can actually, why don't you stay on with me, Michael? It's someone that we're working with to support currently. We'll let the other people sign off and then turn off the recording, and we'll take that up. As always, please reach out individually to any of us for feedback. Send work early and often. Shop it around. It's all good. Thanks for attending tonight, and we look forward to seeing your work later in the week.
questions.